Okay. Hello, everyone. How are we doing this Tuesday morning? Very good. Okay, so today, we need to do a couple things. We need to wrap up our discussion on theories of justification, and then we're going to move on and start new directions in epistemology. So, let's share my screen so that everyone can see. So we left off about here. Oh, there's a hungry cat. One moment. Here you are, sir. So, yeah, we were talking about belief without evidence when we left off last time. And recall, just since I mentioned Clifford here, William K. Clifford, that Clifford thought it was always wrong to believe a proposition with insufficient evidence. And the example that we focused on and that tends to get focused on the most is that of the ship owner, right? We have a terrible ship in disrepair. The owner sends it on its way. Nothing happens. It makes it. The crew are safe. The cargo is safe. Um, Clifford would say that even though nothing bad happened to the ship, and something could have happened to the ship, um, therefore, it was wrong for the person to have believed it was fine to send the ship on its way, considering its need for repair or its lack of ability, potential lack of ability to survive the voyage. And we analogize this with the Titan submarine disaster, which is of course tragic, um, and which I think Clifford would have said should never have been put to sea at all. Right? If you're somebody like Clifford, you would say, well, it wasn't just the final voyage when the ship imploded that was wrong. It was every subsequent voyage of the Titan submarine because it was not built sufficiently to withstand the depths it was diving to. So that was sort of what we were talking about. And we segued into William James, who believed that it is actually acceptable to believe in certain propositions under certain circumstances without evidence. It's not okay all the time, but there are cases where it might make a practical difference in your life. These are these pragmatic grounds I mentioned here in the slides. Like pragmatic in philosophy means practical, essentially. So, what is good for you? There are some cases where it will be okay for you to accept a proposition without evidence. And it's not okay to do this on epistemic grounds, but rather because it may have a positive effect in your life to believe a proposition without evidence. So, for example, the one that comes to mind and the one that James is concerned about is religious belief, religious faith. Yeah, Sarah, like the existence of God, exactly. But also matters of love and romance, um, as well as ethics. Although, here I think is where the real disagreement with James and Clifford will come, right? Would James have have countenance sending this ship that was in disrepair? I don't know, probably not. I don't think he would have, but he would say that perhaps where religious matters extend into ethical ones, it might be okay to believe in propositions without evidence. But when is it okay? Okay, so like when is it okay for James to believe in a proposition for which you have no evidence? Well, he calls these propositions that we could believe in hypotheses, like a scientific hypothesis, but for anything, just like a sentence that may or may not be true. We don't know, and we don't have evidence. That's a hypothesis. And you can believe in a hypothesis if it is live, forced, and momentous. What that means is that your hypothesis has to be, um, something that you could plausibly act on or plausibly choose to believe. So if it's a living or a live hypothesis, it's something that, um, you know, say you're considering belief in God, right? If that is live, a live option for you, that's because you could plausibly believe that there is a God. Now, it's not going to be live for everybody, right? For some people, this is just not a live option, but for some people, it is. Um, so we need a live option, and that option also has to be forced. So it's impossible for you not to choose. You have to choose to believe or to not believe, and you can't just remain agnostic. James thought that, when it comes to God's existence, right? It's like this. We either believe or we don't. Don't be an agnostic, right? You can believe or you can be an atheist, but don't be all like, ooh, I don't know. We can't know. Ooh, no, you have to pick. It's okay to pick, James says. So, if it's something you could plausibly choose to believe or to act on, that gives you the live option. And if you have to choose, you can't just remain agnostic. You've got to choose one or the other, belief or no belief. And finally, you need your live forced option to be momentous. So it has to appeal to your passional nature. The stakes have to be high, right? Imagine a momentous option like the following. It might actually be something like taking a submarine to go and see the wreckage of the Titanic, right? It might be a once in a lifetime opportunity. So, if you don't go, you might never get to go. Let's stipulate that the submarine is proven to be safe, right? You're not taking the Titan submersible here. You're taking like one of James Cameron's submarines or something, right? Something that's really safe, right? Or a trip to the North Pole, or um, the chance to visit outer space, right? These are momentous. The stakes are high. You probably only get one shot. Or actually, one shot. Think of Eminem in the movie 8 Mile, who only has one shot, one opportunity, right? To win the what is it, a rap battle, right? That's what that song "Lose Yourself" is about. Lose yourself in the moment. It's a momentous occasion, to spit funky, fresh rhymes and win the rap battle, and defeat your lyrical opponents, and win the girl of your dreams, et cetera, et cetera, right? So we've got one good example already from James of a genuine option. That is a hypothesis that is living, forced, and momentous, and that is belief in God. Like, take the proposition God exists. We don't have evidence. It's something that for James, you're supposed to take on faith. So you can either believe it or not believe it. That's why it's forced. It's live because a lot of people are willing to act on this. Like, if I asked you, some of you are going to say, yes, I believe in God. No, I don't. Right? Or yes or no, I don't. We might have a few agnostics, but James would say, just pick a side, right? And James thinks this is also, of course, momentous because the stakes might be high. It might make a big difference in your life. It'll affect the way you live. Whether you go to church, go to synagogue, go to the mosque, whether you participate in your community, etc., participate in a religious community, um, or whether you join I don't know, some kind of secular society, or whether you don't do that at all, right? Um, can we think of any other genuine options? Options which might be live, forced, and momentous. And you can pick an example from your own life if you wish. One for me was going to university. So um, I was willing to act on the possibility. Um, and I felt I had to choose because when I decided to go to university, I was in an unhappy place. I was studying business administration at community college, and I was not pleased with the program. I was not pleased with what I was learning. I wasn't feeling challenged, and I thought I need more. So I had to go to university. It was a living option. I could plausibly choose to go there, so I did. And I had to choose, go, stop what I'm doing and do this, or keep doing what I'm doing, right? And the stakes were high, because it turned out it had a big impact on the direction in my life, right? I'm here teaching you philosophy, right? So, um, yeah, marriage. I would say marriage is really good, Cormac, and that highlights, we've been talking about matters of religious faith, but matters of love and romance. Yeah, say you're going to ask your sweetheart to marry you, right? It's a big deal, and whether they say yes is also, if you like, your marriage proposal as well as your partner's response to that proposal. These are both, I would say, genuine options for a great many people. So momentous, Sarah, is like the stakes are high. It's do or die. You have one chance. So it's like if you don't take the opportunity, it may never come again. I think of those kinds of things as momentous. Moving out in certain circumstances, perhaps, especially if you're striking out on your own, all alone. Good question, Chloe. So a hypothesis is something that we could believe in, but which we don't have any evidence for. So we have to kind of make a leap of faith. Now, keep in mind, leap of faith is not James's term. It's actually due to Soren Kierkegaard. But in the colloquial sense, not the technical sense, um, James is saying when you have to make a leap of faith, you can decide whether to do so, um, in part by examining whether you've got a genuine option. But yeah, moving out, marriage. I don't know about belief in evolution, because it's not really what we would call a hypothesis. It's not a hypothesis in the Jamesian sense, nor in the scientific sense. So, um, I guess for certain people, deciding to not believe in it might be a live option. It might be momentous, I suppose. But it's also not exactly a matter of faith, because it's been very well demonstrated. So, so again, like what James has in mind is more stuff that has practical value in your life rather than matters of science, right? And James, by the way, was not just interested in pragmatic philosophy. He was, after a fashion, also a scientist. He was one of the early initiators of psychology. Um, so he is sort of sensitive to matters of science and matters of faith, right? So if you have a genuine option, if it's living, forced, and momentous, if your hypothesis is living, forced, and momentous, you can believe in it on pragmatic grounds because it makes a positive difference in your life. Yeah, Cormac, good question. Like, can you not just avoid things endlessly? I suppose you could. but is that going to be good for you? Right? Because another thing we need to keep in mind with pragmatism is that, it's not just what's practical, it's like, think about where the word practical comes from. Practice, right? It shares a sort of etymological connection with the word practice, right? Something that you do. You practice a skill or you practice good habits because they're good for you, right? So you don't want to just um continue to avoid things, continue to avoid making these choices, because it might not be good for you. That's why you've got to choose, right? Um, I mean, you might endlessly keep switching universities, not knowing what to major in, studying at different programs, trying to find the right place for you, and never really settle in and buckle down. And that might be bad for your studies, bad for your social life. You might spend so much time in school, you run out of funding. I know it seems like OSAP will fund you forever, but they won't. I think you have a certain number of months that they will fund you for, right? So James is like, if it can make a difference in your life, you've got to make a choice. Yeah, Sarah, that's kind of what I was saying in response to the previous, not the previous comment, but one of the previous comments. Some people do, I think, treat this as a matter of faith, but they tend to be, um, how do I put this? I would argue that treating belief in evolution as a matter of faith betrays a misunderstanding of what science does, and how scientific theory works, right? When we say something like the theory of evolution, we don't mean like, oh, I have this theory, right? Like I have a theory that Jar Jar Binks is actually a Sith Lord in the Star Wars prequel trilogies, right? We don't mean like that. A theory in science is a framework, an explanatory framework that helps us to predict and understand reality by integrating, by using laws of nature. So, in the case of evolution, the law that Darwin identified was natural selection, law of natural selection. And so what theories do is they take these laws and we use these theoretical frameworks to explain and predict reality. And so that's why it's not really a matter of faith. Um, Maybe somebody who we call an evidentialist would say, sure, you can believe in some things on pragmatic grounds, but pragmatic justification isn't the same as epistemic justification. So when James is saying, like, it's okay to believe in God, for example, an evidentialist will say, well, that's fine on pragmatic grounds, but not on epistemic grounds. Um, and Clifford, by the way, going back to Clifford, is much more of an evidentialist. You need evidence to believe in a proposition, and that evidence, the evidence that determines whether the proposition is true, is not like pragmatic evidence, it's epistemic evidence. So pragmatic justification just tells us, what might be good for us. And epistemic justification is what helps us determine whether a belief is true. Well, fate is an interesting term, Sarah. So fate suggests to me something like divine or supernatural, whereas like if you compare fate to the idea of determinism, which we'll get to in coming chapters, determinism is the idea that everything is determined, by like the laws of nature. So I might be determined. I might not have free will. I might be determined in the sense that I'm beholden to my genetics, by how I was raised, by the society that I live in, right? And that's just like cold physical processes unfolding. Fate is similar, but it has this sort of divine directionality to it, where kind of like people in another class were asking me what the phrase "everything happens for a reason" means, right? And that phrase implies a kind of fate. um, so as far as the difference between fate and justified beliefs, I guess, well, justified beliefs are a completely different thing. Like, um, but fate is the idea that you're, I guess, determined by some higher supernatural or divine purpose. Um, of course, whether you believe that might, like the question of belief in something like fate or in free will over determinism, um, might be a genuine option for James. Like really, like we can argue about whether we have free will to the cow. Like if we just bracket faith or bracket fate, we could argue about free will and whether we have it until the cows come home. And it's not really something that we can uh, do an experiment, and see, okay, do we have free will? Although some have attempted to do this. Um, but it's not straightforward, right? It's not straightforward to just do an experiment to decide whether people have free will or not. So you might just decide, again, on pragmatic grounds, and I'll get to Jeremiah's question, to believe that you are free. Because if you believe that you are free, that is undetermined. You're free in the sense that you can always do otherwise. Well, now we can have a society where we can hold people morally responsible for their actions, right? So that brings me to Jeremiah's question, pragmatic grounds. That's practical grounds. What would make a practical difference for you in your life? So, going back to the example I just used, um, it makes a practical difference in your life if you believe in free will, in all of our lives, arguably. Because even if we are all determined by forces beyond our control, we live in a society that treats individuals as um, beings who are free, beings who can do otherwise. And that's how we can be held responsible for the things that we do, right? If I'm just an automaton and I'm not the source of my actions, I can't legitimately be praised for doing something good or punished for doing something bad because there's no agent who does those things, right? Um, so we might all lack free will, but we all sort of believe that we have it, so that we can have a society that functions well, and that's perhaps done on pragmatic grounds. It's good for us to do it that way. Um, we can skip this discussion here. Well, we can use it as an opportunity to do a little recap. You might be thinking as we make our way through this material, thinking about whether you are a foundationalist or a coherentist, whether you believe that knowledge is built upon basic beliefs that might not require justification by other beliefs. That would make you a foundationalist, or you might be a coherentist. So knowledge is more like a spider web or a jigsaw puzzle, and everything kind of hangs together. Um, you can think about whether evidentialism can answer the challenges of a skeptic. A skeptic is, again, if we're depending on the kind of skeptic we are, we believe that most, if not all, of our beliefs don't count as knowledge. We might have plenty of true beliefs, but the skeptic, remember, will say that just they don't count as knowledge. They don't meet that criteria. Maybe the evidence doesn't have to be perfect, though. Maybe it just has to be good enough. And then lastly, what we've just been talking about is whether it is okay to believe things in the absence of evidence for pragmatic reasons. I think it really depends. It really depends not only on whether it will make a practical difference in your life, but it also depends on what kind of difference it might make in another's life. So, um, if you believe without evidence that it is safe to take the Titan submersible to go to the bottom of the sea, and then you convince someone else to come with you, which tragically is what happened. Well, firstly, with the person running the show convincing his patrons that it's safe to take people down there, and also we discussed this a little bit last time. Um, I think there was a one of the passengers brought their son who didn't really want to go, right? I mean, that made a difference in his life, a pretty bad difference. But when it comes to something like religious belief, um, well, again, it depends. Like, if you decide to believe for your own, just for you, because it will make a practical difference in your life, that's one thing. Um, but then, how does that affect others in your life? I guess it depends. I guess it depends on the religion, right? Or whether it's religion versus a cult, right? Like maybe you decide to join a religious community. Actually, my cousin, I got a great example. I have a cousin um, uh, who, for a long time, I didn't know to be religious. Um, but recently he's become quite religious. He's actually has the near future goal of becoming a rabbi. So he converted from, I don't know what he was before, an atheist or agnostic, converted to Judaism, and now has the goal of becoming a rabbi, which seems to be the right choice for him. Seems to be making a positive difference in his life, right? Um, but then if you have a family member, a relative who decides to join some kind of weird cult, um, some kind of cult that um, tries to how cults work where they prevent you from talking to your friends and family and isolate you from the outside world and that sort of thing. That would be bad for you and arguably for your friends and family because they would worry about you, right? Yeah, Jonah, like Scientology, right? Yeah, like when I was reconnecting with my cousin and learned that he was thinking of going to rabbinical school, I thought, oh, that's pretty cool. You're a smart guy. You'll probably do really well. Um, I have to admit, it's a little bit puzzling to me because I'm, like full disclosure, I am what a philosopher would call a weak atheist, which is just somebody who generally lacks a belief in God. So a strong atheist is someone who believes there is no God. And a weak atheist is somebody who's like, well, I just don't believe. I don't necessarily believe there isn't one, but I don't believe there is. So that's weak atheism from Antony Flew. So yeah, it was a little bit hard for me to put myself in my cousin's shoes, but it seems to be working out for him. So great, that's great. Um, but if he had been like, "Hey, nice to talk to you, Josh. By the way, I'm joining the Church of Scientology," then I might have been like, "Ooh, I don't know if you might want to reconsider, right?" Or what was the one where they drank the Kool-Aid? Was that the Heaven's Gate cult? This happened when I was a child, so I don't remember all the details. But that phrase, you've drunk the Kool-Aid, like you've been brainwashed. Yeah, Jonestown comes to mind. Maybe they're the same thing. Was the Heaven's Gate cult in Jonestown? I honestly can't remember. I was quite young when this happened, but the point is that the entire cult was convinced to commit suicide by drinking Kool-Aid that had been poisoned. Yeah, Quinn, there you go. Yeah, Jonestown is the city where it happened. Thank you. Because it was something about, there was a comet and the aliens were going to take people up, but they had to be dead. Then the aliens were going to take their souls, something like that. So they all drank Kool-Aid. They all died. And this is where the phrase drinking the Kool-Aid, like you've drunk the Kool-Aid, we use this today now, and it's a colloquialism for like, when somebody's been brainwashed, they've drunk the Kool-Aid. Um, you know, um, it's pretty it's pretty wild. But these organizations do exist. So, I mean, I think it probably depends on the belief in question. What do you all think? Why don't you let me know in the chat while I refill my coffee cup? So I'll be right back. Hello, Dula. Oh, my back. Ooh, moving slowly today. My back is very sore. Oof. Okay, well, nobody has said anything, but I don't know. Do maybe we don't have any strong feelings either way. Um, well, yeah, yeah. I mean, it. Yeah, I don't think you're wrong about that, Quinn. Like, um, after all, this is for a subject. For you. You are a subject, right? So it's going to be subjective because it's about what makes a difference in your life, right? And that actually leads to a really interesting point, I think. Like when it comes to what's true, like the evidentialist might say, or the traditional epistemologist would say, well, what's true is like what's objectively true. What's true out, what is the case out in the world? But James would say, well, okay, sure, there is that, but there's also what makes a difference for you, the existing subject, right? No, I mean, oh yeah, so yeah, okay, cool, yeah. These terms, like I said, come from a guy named Antony Flew, philosopher, also known for the no true Scotsman fallacy. Um, But yeah, not everyone uses the terms the same way, right? Some people would say a weak atheist is just an agnostic, and that a strong atheist is a proper atheist. Some would say that a strong atheist is actually an anti-theist, and that a weak atheist is an atheist. But I like Flew's terminology. So strong atheism is a is like a negative belief, um, and weak atheism is a lack of belief. That's the way I understand the term. So yeah, Rachel says, could it be the person who believes in God because they've had God experiences? Yeah, maybe. I would say that that's like what Quinn was saying. That's more of a subjective thing. But it's interesting because I don't know what James would do with that because James is talking about believing in the absence of evidence. But then if you have like an experience um, that makes you believe, then you're using that as evidence. Like, I think the example that I tend to gravitate towards is Cat Stevens, right? Anyone know Cat Stevens, Yusuf Islam? He's swimming in the ocean, and this riptide gets him, and he's afraid that he's going to drown. So he calls out, he says a prayer in desperation, and he said, you know, uh, something like, God, if you save me, I'll work for you. Um, He survived and then spent a few months kind of like exploring all of the world's religions and eventually settled on Islam. Um, and so that experience for him was almost like a piece of evidence. Um, is that what James is talking about? I don't know, because James is like, hey, if you don't have any evidence, you got to decide. Don't wait till you're drowning in the ocean, James would say. He'd say you've got to decide beforehand, right? Um, so yeah, I don't really know. Yeah, James, that's what I think James would say. Um, but certainly many people do interpret certain what we could call anomalous experiences as evidence for God and form a belief on that basis. Yeah, that's fair, Kara. Uh, whoop. Yeah, I guess you could say that. I'm not sure. I'm really not sure. I would say that uh maybe James would say, so you've had this experience, um and you can decide what to do with it. Like, okay, I've had this experience. I can believe that that was um a message from the divine or a sign, or I cannot, right? So I guess, yeah, it could still work as a hypothesis. It's tricky. There's a little bit of ambiguity here, right? A near-death experience, yeah, similar idea, right? Incidentally, I use the term anomalous experience. Yeah, psychologists call such things anomalous experiences because they're outside of our everyday experience, right? So people have near-death experiences, out-of-body experiences, lucid dreams. Um, some people believe they get abducted by aliens or visited by demons, and these are anomalous psychological states. Um, the trick is, how do we explain them? I tend to explain them naturalistically, but that's because I'm a philosopher and a scientist. Of course, not everyone is going to take the same approach, right? Um, there are many cases, let's take a relatively innocuous example, but there are many cases where people succumb to a phenomenon called sleep paralysis, which is an interesting phenomenon. It can happen to any one of us. It's not a medical disorder. It's just a sort of like mishap, a sort of mishap of the brain and body, where when you're in REM sleep and you're dreaming, the body is mostly paralyzed, so you don't act out your dreams. But of course, you're asleep. It sometimes happens, though, that people wake up, yet they remain paralyzed and their brain continues on dreaming, so that they will have very, very real experiences, real seeming experiences of being visited by demons or ghosts or being abducted by aliens, right? Oh, okay. So some of you are familiar with this, right? Okay, yeah. It doesn't happen to me. I've never had it happen, which I kind of lament. I'm like, oh boy, it would be interesting to experience. But some people form on the basis of these experiences, beliefs like they've been abducted by aliens. Um, and of course, the likely answer is that, well, it was just sleep paralysis. Um, but I can imagine other anomalous states, in a similar way. Like some people might have near-death experiences and it might inform their belief in a higher power. Then again, it might not, right? Some people are clinically dead and they go through this and they understand it just as an anomalous experience, right? But good talk. We should get on to the next set of slides. So the next set is New Directions in Epistemology from the eponymous chapter in our textbook. Yeah, April, same here. I don't have sleep paralysis, but if I get the chance to sleep in, chances are I will have a lucid dream. a dream where you're dreaming. And those, in my experience, tend to be more vivid because I feel much more present. So I'm able to like actually attend to the details of the scene and everything seems vivid, right?
Have you ever been able to control your dreams, like fly?
Um, Somewhat. I can't just like snap my fingers and poof, I'm somewhere else. My mind doesn't cooperate.
Mine does.
What's that?
Mine does. I actually like once I realize I'm in that dream doing it, I can fly.
Oh yeah. Um, I just can't make like instant changes.
Mm.
But a trick is you just kind of trick your brain like one of the things that you can do is just kind of use your own expectations to try and make things go the way you want. Like if you want to see a certain thing, like let's say, oh, I want to go to the moon, then I just kind of psych myself up and I think, okay, the moon is behind this door. And then you open the door and walk through it, and then it's like, okay, now I'm on the moon, right? So you can just kind of have to trick your brain, right? Um, oh, interesting. I've never heard of that one, Kaya. I have to give that a shot. You can pause, so Shania can pause her dreams. That's I've never heard of that. That's pretty cool. Um, weird. Was he visited by Michael Scott? Is that his name? Or Derek Brent? I don't know. Which office are we talking here? Are we UK office or American office? Yeah. It can be frightening, yeah. Especially when people don't know what it is, it can be very frightening. They might even think, they can even be convinced that there is someone else actually in the room, like somebody who might assault them or something, right? And that can be quite frightening. And then you find that you can't move, because your body is still kind of in REM sleep. So you're like, you think there's someone in the room with you and you can't move. Like, have I been tied up? Have I been kidnapped? Right? It's quite frightening. And yeah, not everyone can remember their dreams. Like, who was it that said Caden? Yeah, it's difficult, but it is a skill you can improve upon. Okay, so let's look at traditional epistemology and then let's get started looking at some new directions in epistemology. So we can think of traditional epistemology as armchair epistemology, something that we can do without a laboratory, right? Like Descartes, I think Crumley has us imagine Descartes sitting in his lazy boy, his 17th century lazy boy, or this statue, The Thinker by Rodin. Um, it's something that we can do just using reason, just doing what our thinker is doing here. And this goes all the way back to Plato. And I've included Aristotle here. Aristotle, um, excuse me. Of course, Aristotle was an empiricist. Plato was the rationalist, and Aristotle was the empiricist. But Aristotle did still do a fair bit of armchair reasoning, even though he thought you should start by observing the world. But a new approach toward epistemology in the 20th century emerged called naturalized epistemology. And this is due to Quine. And this views epistemology as a part of the sciences, not prior to the sciences. So, on traditional epistemology, you do epistemology before you do science, right? And if you have a chance to take a look at the Meditations by Descartes, this is exactly what he's trying to do, right? He wants to establish a firm foundation for the sciences. So sciences are supposed to help us know things. So we have to answer, for what knowledge is and how we come by it. So I guess for most of the history of philosophy, epistemology is what you do before you get into a lab. But naturalized epistemology understands epistemology as part of the sciences, not prior to the sciences. So that's the new direction in epistemology that we're going to look at today. But it's not the only one. The next time we'll look at feminist epistemology. So, feminist epistemology says that for most of human history, um, epistemology is kind of done by men for men. Indeed, most science as well. So there's a bias there. And what feminist epistemology does is try to address some of these worries. Feminism doesn't necessarily mean to do feminist epistemology is not necessarily doing it from a female perspective. Um, what feminism ultimately boils down to is equality of the sexes, not superiority of women over men, as some internet dude bros might try to convince you. Um, so we'll take a look at feminist epistemology next time, but now we'll look at natural epistemology. So in his paper, Epistemology Naturalized, Quine argued that we should view epistemology as, oh, excuse me, as part of the natural sciences. So natural sciences are the sciences that study the natural world. So when we say natural sciences, we have usually things in mind like physics, chemistry, and biology. Quine is saying that epistemology is like those. Um, the aim of epistemology actually should be discovering the causal link between evidence and theory, rather than identifying the justification link between evidence and our beliefs. And like I'll just emphasize this idea of a causal link. I mean, scientists, especially in the natural sciences, but also in the social sciences and the comprehensive sciences and so on, try to identify causal relations between natural phenomena. That's the whole point of science, and by doing this, we uncover scientific laws. Um, so, what's an example? Just think of any scientific finding. I need a scientific finding, and we'll discuss how um, there's a causal link in there somewhere. Could be anything. Yeah, Earth is round or the atomic model, right? So where's the causal stuff in the idea that the Earth is round? Well, say that you are watching, maybe you're in ancient Greece or something, and you notice that when ships sail away, um, their hulls disappear over the horizon first, and their masts disappear last. What causes that? Or you look at the moon during a lunar eclipse and you see that the shadow of the Earth on the moon is round, and you ask, what causes that round shadow? Or maybe you're like Aristophanes, an ancient Greek scientist who said, "I heard this story that at the tropic of whatever tropic it is, on the longest day of the year, sticks don't cast any shadows, but over here where I live, they do. What's up with that? Why would on the same day one stick placed farther south cast no shadow and a stick further north cast a definite shadow? The answer to all of these questions is that the earth is round. Penicillin? Yeah, like science would explain the causal link between taking penicillin and being cured of a bacterial infection. And similarly with the atom, like the structure of the atom would have been worked out by observing the effects of certain things on other things. So science is all about identifying these cause effect relations in the natural world. That's ultimately what it boils down to. Like, and I know you read the headlines nowadays and it's like, oh, scientists discover this new thing, like this new animal that we didn't know existed, or this new particle, or what's a good one? Um, a new comet in the sky, right? Scientists observe this new comet. We've discovered this comet we didn't know existed. Uh, what we're actually discovering is cause and effect relations. Like, hey, what's that bright light in the sky? Oh, it's a new comet. We haven't seen it before. Let's name it. Let's take lots of pictures of it and try to study it, right? Yeah, dark matter, Quinn. That's a really good one because dark matter is something that we infer. We infer the existence of dark matter because we can't directly observe it, but we can observe its effects on matter that we can see, right? That's a really good example. In the same way, what Quine thinks we should be doing with um, naturalized epistemology is discovering a causal link between evidence and theory, not a justification link between evidence and belief. Carbon dioxide, you mean working out what it is? Like working out what this gas is?
Yeah,
Or
because it's not something that we can like see, right? So it's kind of like that dark matter. We just know that
oh,
there's
yeah.
cause and effect.
Yeah, like I saw a video on the internet not too long ago actually about this cave where there's carbon dioxide in the cave and carbon dioxide is heavier than oxygen, so of course it sinks. So if you go in this cave, you're dead, right? Because you don't know you're surrounded by CO2 and not oxygen, so you'll just go in there and suffocate basically. Um, but the tour guide did a demonstration where he had a torch that was burning. And then as soon as he lowered it into the cave, the flame went out because it was starved of oxygen. So that's like a way we can infer, like, okay, what caused the torch to go out? Well, there was no oxygen. So there's CO2 in that cave. Don't go in that cave, right? Yeah, so that's a good example. Um, okay, so let's review some tenets of traditional epistemology. It's very Cartesian, right? That means that the epistemology that Quine is critical of is really epistemology done in the tradition of Descartes, right? And remember these we've looked at these two dogmas of empiricism that Quine discusses. One, of course, is this commitment to a priori reasoning, and you'll remember one of the dogmas of empiricism is that we don't have a good we rely on this a priori approach, this foundationalist approach, but Quine's complaint is that we don't have a good understanding of what the a priori is. The a priori statements are the synonymous statements, which are the necessary statements, which are also the a priori statements, right? It's that circle Quine identifies, right? And another dogma is foundationalism. So again, um, on Cartesian epistemology, you have a set of basic beliefs that are they're justified, but not by other beliefs. So they're either self-justified or they're justified by anything from perception to introspection. Um, and Quine is not a foundationalist, right? He's a coherentist. Um, so if you're a Cartesian, though, your basic beliefs have got to be infallible. You cannot be mistaken about them. And Descartes, of course, thought that the cogito was infallible. He thought he could not be mistaken about his existence. Although perhaps we can be, right? I don't want to get ahead of myself, but there are certain traditions that deny the existence of the self, like Buddhism. Buddhism would say that the self is an illusion. So you could be mistaken about the self. You could be mistaken about whether you exist, right? But the point is that on the traditional approach, we have a set of basic beliefs, and all our other beliefs are built on that and justified in part by our basic beliefs. And we can kind of trace the justification for our non-basic beliefs back to our basic ones. So that's a little recap. Oh, why won't my slides move? Ah, there we go. Um, and again, that's the sort of traditional approach, the Cartesian foundationalism. That's one tenet. Another is that we do philosophy, or we do epistemology, again, from the armchair, as it were. It's an a priori endeavor, as I've said in the slides here. We can discover the conditions of our knowledge a priori, independently of sense experience. We can arrive at knowledge either way. Like we can arrive at knowledge using a priori reasoning or a posteriori reasoning, but we discover the justification conditions of knowledge a priori by just thinking about them. You know, that's what we were doing when we were talking about the traditional analysis um, and Gettier cases, right? Like when in the Meno, the dialogue Meno, when Socrates is explaining to Meno why knowledge is better than true belief or true opinion. He does it with an illustrative example, right? The images of Daedalus, but they're not in a lab, right? They're having a conversation with one another, um, and they're just reasoning out what knowledge is and why it's better than true belief. Or the Gettier cases, like these are imaginary examples that seem to undermine the traditional analysis. And again, we're just thinking these up, right? We're not in a lab doing experiments. We're like, huh, so if I look at a clock that reads 4 p.m. and it really is 4 p.m., but that clock is broken and it's just stuck at 4 p.m., do I really have knowledge or just a true belief? Right? Let's think about it. It's armchair epistemology. It's a priori, right? It's the commitment to reasoning out the conditions of justification in an a priori fashion that leads to certain additional features of traditional epistemology, like epistemology being distinct from the sciences. So we can't really just stop doing epistemology and replace it with something else, like psychology, right? Because it's not that kind of thing. It's distinct from the sciences, and it's prior to the sciences, as I said earlier. Um, Science is what we use to discover new knowledge. Epistemology is how we know what knowledge is versus true belief versus false belief. Epistemology gives us the tools we need in order to do science, but it's not itself a science according to the traditional view. Okay, so we could kind of summarize these features as follows. On traditional epistemology, knowledge has this foundational structure, a la Descartes. It's a priori, that is, we arrive at our epistemological principles using a priori reasoning. Epistemology is distinct from the sciences and it is prior to the sciences. Now, Quine says natural epistemology should reject all of this. So, what is natural epistemology? It really comes from Quine's commitment to naturalism. So, what is naturalism? Um, Naturalism says that everything that exists is just what is natural. So, what does that mean? Well, it means essentially two important things. If you're a naturalist, you believe that the only things that exist are those that we find in nature. That is everything in the universe, matter, energy, their associated properties, their relations with one another. These are the only real things, just what exists in the natural universe. So no, there's no supernatural stuff, for example. There's no paranormal stuff. It's all natural, right? Like lightning is just electromagnetic discharge in the atmosphere. It's not Zeus hurling thunderbolts or something else supernatural like that, right? Also, the natural world is causally closed. So, any event, any event you can think of will have a sufficient physical cause or natural cause. There's no need to attribute a supernatural cause. So again, if lightning strikes the tree beside my apartment, it's just because there was a negative electrical charge coming down from the clouds and it wants to go to the ground. And the tree was the highest thing, so the lightning hits the tree and the electricity finds its way to ground like it wants to do. It's not because Zeus is angry with me. That would be a case of over-determination, causal over-determination. Like, what are you telling me here, Professor? That lightning is electromagnetic discharge and Zeus is mad at me? Well, no, it's only the one, right? We only need the one to explain lightning. So that's naturalism. Now, what does science do? It helps us discover the relations between these natural objects, the causal relations. And it helps us discover the properties of these objects. So that's what science is for, to help us learn about the natural world. And Quine said naturalism is the recognition that it is within science itself, not in some prior philosophy, that reality is to be identified and described. So epistemology is part of the sciences. Well, he might be. I mean, that's certainly what people at one time thought. It's even freaky, like, sometimes weird stuff happens and we see connections that aren't there, right? Like there was a viral video of a guy, he was like, okay, he was outside and it was raining and he just like snaps his fingers and the lightning happens to strike right when he snaps his fingers. So we perceive that as like, he caused the lightning or perhaps solicited a lightning strike from Zeus, right? Or another interesting viral video I saw was people doing with people counting down to zero and then a volcano erupts, and of course it's just coincidental, but we perceive it as causal. But yeah, some people do. Uh, I I don't understand this, but some people still do to this day see signs, right? Which they think are for them. But that's not something that I really understand personally. Yeah, like Jesus on your toast or something like that. Yeah, yeah. Quine says that the only things that exist are natural things, physical things, the things in the physical world. So I kind of tend to use the words natural and physical more or less interchangeably. That's because I mean fundamentally they mean the same thing. Like nature is from the Latin for natura, and physical is from physis, the ancient Greek, which just means nature. So really they mean the same thing. Yeah, that's what people say, right? Like, well, because otherwise, if you don't get any kickbacks, what are you doing here? Like, hey, Zeus, I made the sacrifice at your altar. Why are you throwing thunderbolts outside my apartment? Of course, if you know your Greek mythology, you know that the gods were capricious and hard to please and difficult to understand. Very Old Testament. It's kind of actually like the way that God is depicted in the Old Testament. That is as an angry, jealous, capricious God is not that dissimilar from the Olympian gods. So, so traditional epistemology, according to Quine, has a problem. It doesn't show us how to get out of our own heads into the world. Science tells us lots about the world, but epistemology doesn't make the connection that Quine thinks it should between our beliefs about the world and the world itself. So, if, for example, we begin in our own minds, in our own heads, as it were, with some foundational set of a priori beliefs, those are our basic beliefs. How do we connect uh, those beliefs to the world, to the way the world is? Epistemology, traditionally conceived, doesn't really give us a way to do that. And if we start with, not from a set of foundational beliefs, but if we start reasoning about the world, then we're just doing science. So let's just start with science. Now, that's the claim that's motivating Quine. We can't draw logical connections between our epistemological principles and the world. So we can't identify these principles that tell us what we ought to believe. So why don't we instead ask how we came to believe the propositions that we do believe? Quine writes, like, better to discover how science is in fact developed and learned than to fabricate a fictitious structure to a similar effect. Like, ooh, those are strong words. And even if we replace traditional epistemology with psychology or some other cognitive science, epistemology would carry on. Importantly, I think this comes later in the slides, but I think I'll mention it now just because we're getting a little close to the end of class. But um, another tenet of traditional epistemology, which Quine covers a bit later in the chapter, or which Crumley covers later in the chapter, is that epistemology, traditionally conceived, is normative. So norms are like rules, right? So a norm is a rule. So when something is normative, it expresses how something ought to be. And that's what we mean by saying that traditional epistemology is normative. It sets the rules for what one ought to or ought not to believe, right? Science is descriptive, not normative. So when psychology is giving you, or when epistemology gives you an ought, like you ought to believe this proposition, you ought not to believe this proposition. Um, what psychology does, it just explains how we come to believe. So that's the difference. Um, so a consequence of Quine's approach is that if we begin with science, um, rather than with a foundational set of basic beliefs, then we're abandoning the foundationalist approach altogether. And we don't use a priori reasoning to tell us about knowledge. Rather, we learn about the nature of knowledge by doing science. Quine famously wrote that the Humean predicament is the human predicament. Remember, Hume's skepticism uh, was ultimately tied to um, the what we discussed about the uniformity principle. So I'm never rationally justified in believing that, for example, the future will resemble the past or that an effect will follow a cause. because there's no necessary connection between the future and the past or cause and effect. Rather, um, I'm naturally inclined to believe that the future will be like the past or that certain effects will follow certain causes, but I'm not rationally justified in doing so. That's the Humean predicament. And that's the human predicament, right? We don't have I mean we want these logical connections between our foundational beliefs and the world, but we're never going to get them. It's just not how it works. So let's do science instead. And here's how Quine responds to the skeptic's challenge of that none of our beliefs can count as knowledge. What are the consequences? Yeah, okay, so the consequences of you mean of the naturalist approach. One is that we basically have to abandon foundationalism. Um, and we're not doing a priori reasoning to tell us what knowledge is like. Instead, we're doing science to learn about the nature of knowledge. So we're not having like a Platonic dialogue about the nature of knowledge, a la Socrates and Meno in Plato's Meno. Instead, we're doing something like what a psychologist does, like a cognitive psychologist in the laboratory, studying how people acquire beliefs. Okay, so here's what he says about skepticism. Quine says skepticism is an offshoot of science. The basis for skepticism is the awareness of illusion, the discovery that we must not always believe our eyes. Skepticism battens on mirages, on seemingly bent sticks in water, on rainbows, after images, double images, dreams. But in what sense are these illusions? In the sense that they seem to be material objects, which they in fact are not. Illusions are illusions only relative to a prior acceptance of genuine bodies with which to contrast them. Rudimentary physical science, that is, common sense about bodies, is thus needed as a springboard for skepticism. So, skeptics, according to Quine, are actually presupposing science, right? We can only understand what illusions, etc., are because we already accept the existence of real objects out in the world. Now, maybe a traditional epistemologist would accuse Quine of begging the question against the skeptic. And remember, begging the question is a technical term. So I don't want to see, like in your essays, I don't want to see you saying, this begs the question when you should actually be using the term raise the question. Begging the question is a kind of circular reasoning where the conclusion you set out to prove already features as a premise in your argument. And so you get a circle. So is Quine begging the question against the skeptic? Like, hey, you skeptics, you must already believe that there's a world out there because you realize that we can sometimes be mistaken, right? You can only realize that you're mistaken about perceiving something if you already think that there is something out there that you could perceive the right way, right? Is Quine begging the question? Well, maybe. Um, how would a skeptic respond? Well, a skeptic might respond by saying, like somebody like Descartes might respond by saying, no, no, it's not this or that particular perceptual illusion that makes me a skeptic. It's just that that's made me come to realize that my senses don't represent the world veridically at all, right? My senses are just representing, my mind, my senses together make a representation of the world, which approximates the world in certain important ways, but doesn't really show me exactly what the world is like, right? So maybe a skeptic could reply that way. And maybe these naturalized epistemologists are assuming that what's really at stake is the epistemic credibility of science, right? Like, how is it that science is epistemically credible? How can we trust it? to help us generate new knowledge. So Quine is saying, like, you skeptics aren't really skeptics because, you go on talking about illusions and misperceptions and so forth. But in order to have an illusion, there must be a way it really is out there in the world. So you skeptics, you're not really skeptics. You already believe um in the external world, and we can use science to study it. And the skeptics might say, well, no, that's not true, right? We just don't think that um our perceptions of the world, for example, um meet the epistemic criteria to count as knowledge. It's a little complicated, right? A simpler example of begging the question is the Cartesian circle, right? I've mentioned this before. Um, how do I how do I know that God exists? Well, I have a clear and distinct idea of God. Um, how can I trust my clear and distinct ideas? God is not a deceiver. Okay, great, but those only independently support one another, and there's no outside support for either of those propositions. So it's a circle, right? So yeah, like when what Quine is saying is that when these skeptics, employ something like Descartes' dream argument, they're assuming a rudimentary science. They're assuming that there already exist real objects or real bodies, as Quine and Descartes would say. There is an objective reality out there that we must be able to know about in some sense, because we can know that what we're perceiving, like when we put a stick in the water and it appears bent because of the refraction, we know that the stick is not really bent. Um, I wouldn't worry too much about whether Quine is begging the question against the skeptic here, but rather we should focus um, on how traditional epistemology really differs from or how naturalized epistemology really differs from the traditional approach. So we'll just finish off this slide, I think, and then we'll probably have to end things. But if we're going to be natural epistemologists, we have to let go of our idea that theoretical beliefs are justified in connection with basic beliefs. So I form some beliefs about the way the world is based upon some foundational basic beliefs. And on traditional epistemology, my subsequent belief, my non-basic ones, my theoretical beliefs, are justified via their connections to my basic ones. In naturalized epistemology, we let this go. We don't do this anymore. Yeah, well, I mean, I figure scientists, no, I mean, scientists are going to dig this kind of epistemology for sure, because they're going to say, hey, it's what we're already doing. We're already doing science. Why do we need all this traditional epistemology? Well, we probably still need the traditional. I mean, don't get me wrong. I like naturalism. I like what Quine is trying to do. And maybe his critique of natural epistemology highlights some problems with foundationalism. But that doesn't mean we should abandon it altogether. We still do need it because it is, if it's not prior to the sciences, it is definitely distinct from the sciences. Yeah, psych major. So Quine would say you're doing the epistemology, right? I mean, but here's the real difference, and we'll get to this more next time, but what an epistemologist will do is tell you when you ought or ought not to believe, and a psychologist will tell you when people do and don't believe. So an epistemologist would say, like, you should believe a proposition with good evidence, but a psychologist would say, it turns out that people believe these propositions because there's evidence, but they believe these propositions because of some cognitive bias, right? So that's the difference. Um, okay, so we abandon the commitment to foundationalism, and if we want to justify our scientific beliefs, um, we don't do that by connecting those beliefs to basic beliefs, beliefs about what our senses tell us. The example here is like the nature light. How does light works? We don't justify our set of scientific beliefs like, the speed light travels at, by connecting them, or we do. We do. Sorry, I've got this mixed up. We justify our scientific beliefs by connecting them to, um, or never mind. No, I'm misreading this. Oh my goodness, I'm misreading my own slides terribly. Yeah, we don't do it by basic beliefs. Although we do it arguably, by in connection to the senses, because science is empirical. It's just that nowadays we extend our senses um with complicated scientific instruments, right? Like in astronomy, we used to do astronomy with observatories. Before we had telescopes, we had observatories that were kind of like big sort of places with, the degrees of the circle all marked out in a certain way, and we could keep track of where stars and planets were moving by sort of moving around the observatory ourselves and kind of measuring things out with the naked eye and seeing, the positions of different things, especially the planets and the sun and the moon. Um, Now most observatories involve some kind of telescope, right? Could be an optical telescope. It could be like the James Webb Space Telescope, which is, an infrared telescope, right? But these are like extensions of human senses, right? So, so we can reason about the nature of light by the senses and by extensions of our senses, but not maybe not by beliefs about what our senses tell us. I don't know. I mean, not sure if I agree with that, because science is empirical. What we do, though, definitely is like in cognitive neuroscience or cognitive psychology, we do these branches of sciences, and these tell us how we go from our senses to our beliefs about the world. There's a more important difference, though, and that's the normative descriptive distinction, which we'll get to next time. We should wrap it up because we're actually 1 minute over time, and I see people are already checking out. Um, so we'll finish these slides today, or not today. We'll finish these slides tomorrow, and then we will talk about feminist epistemology. So that's the second new direction in epistemology. So thanks, everybody. Oh, I think somebody asked. Not tomorrow. Thursday. Oh my goodness. I must not have had enough coffee. Sorry, everyone. Not tomorrow. Thursday. As someone also asked about when we would get the quiz marks back. I don't have an exact time. I'm hoping next week sometime. Um, so stay tuned for an announcement. Thanks, everyone. I'll see you all on Thursday, and well, have a good rest of your Tuesday. Okay, bye for now.